What kind of city becomes so rich, so violent, and so arrogant that later generations call it the Sodom of the New World? And then, in a single morning, the sea swallows it whole. This is Port Royal, Jamaica, a deep-water pirate hub where private violence became imperial policy and where gold, rum, disease, and death moved through the same streets. But on June 7, 1692, the ground beneath that wealth liquefied. Houses sank. The harbor rose in a tsunami. And one of the most notorious cities in the Caribbean vanished under water and sand within minutes. In this video, we strip away the Hollywood myth of noble pirates and follow the evidence, eyewitness accounts, archaeology, and geology to see how greed built Port Royal and how the earth erased it. The first thing you notice about Port Royal is the heat. Not warmth, heat. The kind that presses into your chest before you fully stepped off the gangplank. The Caribbean sun here doesn't arrive gradually. It drops on you like a decision already made, bleaching dock timber white, cracking pitch between hull planks, forcing the harbor's smell directly into your skin. Salt brine, rotting fish, open sewage moving in slow brown channels between buildings. And underneath all of it, spilled rum fermenting in the streets, rising from every threshold, soaking into stone that has no business staying upright. This is what Port Royal smelled like. This is what it sounded like. Rigging from 2,000 ships, caulking hammers at dawn, arguments in a dozen languages, and always, the slow lap of harbor water against foundations that were never meant to carry what was being asked of them. By 1692, somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 people lived here. Nobody knew the exact number, because nobody was interested in being counted. What we do know, all of them existed on 51 acres. 51. Into that space, they packed 2,000 brick buildings, most of them 2 or 3 stories tall, pressed so tightly together that the streets between them were barely wide enough for 2 men to pass without touching. For context, Boston, the largest English settlement in North America, had a population of roughly 6,000 at the same time. Port Royal had more. In commercial volume, in sheer money moving through a single harbor in a single day, it was arguably the most important English port in the entire Western Hemisphere. 213 ships visited in 1688 alone. And then there is the one number that tells you everything. At its peak, Port Royal had 1 drinking establishment for every 10 residents. Not 1 per 100, 1 per 10. 44 licensed tavern keepers, 4 goldsmiths, 1 church. The priorities were not hidden. They were the entire point. Below those taverns, below those warehouses full of Spanish silver, below the cannon platforms and the brick merchant houses, 65 feet of water-saturated sand sat quietly, waiting for the right sequence of events. Patient, indifferent, completely unaware that it was the most important geological feature in the Caribbean. That sand had a purpose, and England knew exactly what to build on top of it. The Caribbean in the mid-17th century was not a neutral body of water. It was a Spanish lake, governed, patrolled, and defended by an empire that had spent 150 years building the most profitable colonial network in human history. Spain's position was simple. The Western Hemisphere had been granted to them by papal decree in 1493. Every other flag was, by definition, an intrusion. And Madrid was prepared to act on that position with silver-funded warships and fortified ports from Florida to the southern tip of South America. England could not afford a permanent naval presence in those waters. The distances were too vast. The money wasn't there. And so the Crown made a calculation that would define Port Royal for the next 3 decades. Instead of a fleet, They would use men who didn't need to be paid. Men who would finance themselves on whatever they could take, in exchange for a piece of paper that said they were acting with official authorization. Governor Thomas Modiford arrived in Jamaica in June of 1664, with explicit instructions from London to suppress privateering. He issued a formal proclamation against it on June 11th. He reversed that proclamation before the end of the same month. Not the same year, the same month. His private explanation, sent back to London, was almost elegant in its honesty. He thought it more prudent to do that by degrees and moderation, which I once resolved to have executed suddenly and severely. What he didn't include in the letter was the more straightforward reason. He charged £20 per commission. He extracted further fees on every condemned prize. Roughly 1,500 privateers were using Port Royal as their base, and that money moved through the entire colonial economy like blood. Without it, Jamaica was a failing agricultural outpost. With it, it was a shield. Into this arrangement stepped Henry Morgan, born in Wales around 1635. No inherited wealth, no family connections in the Caribbean. Just a man who understood, with unusual precision, what this system rewarded and what it required. By 1668, Modiford was addressing him in official documents as Admiral Henry Morgan. Not a criminal, not a tolerated outlaw, but a senior officer of the Crown with formal command over all English privateers in the region. That same year, Morgan took Portobello, one of the most fortified ports on the Spanish Main. He used captured Catholic priests and nuns as human shields to carry the scaling ladders under enemy fire. The castle fell. 100,000 pesos. Paid. The line between the state and the raid had not been blurred. It had been deliberately removed. So what did that actually produce at street level? Picture one of Morgan's men returning from the Portobello raid. His share, roughly £60 sterling, 2 to 3 times the annual wage of a plantation worker. He has been at sea for months. He is sunburned, salt-cracked, and carrying a specific kind of hunger that has nothing to do with food. He steps off the dock at Port Royal. Within 72 hours, the money is gone. Not stolen, not lost. Spent. In the taverns, the gambling houses, the brothels pressed wall to wall along every street between the harbor and the fort. This was not weakness. This was the economy functioning exactly as designed. The men who got rich in Port Royal were almost never the men who sailed. They were the tavern keepers who extended credit at punishing rates, the merchants who bought looted Chinese porcelain and Spanish silver at a fraction of its value and resold it through legitimate channels, and the landlords who charged rent on buildings that should not, by any engineering standard, have been standing. One visitor in 1683, Francis Hanson, noted with astonishment that the cash flowing through Port Royal's market rivaled London's. He meant it as a compliment. He didn't mention where the cash came from or how quickly it disappeared. And disappear was also what the people did. Europeans arriving in Port Royal for the first time had no immunity to what circulated in the harbor district. Yellow fever, called the black vomit by the men who watched it kill their bunkmates, could take a healthy man in 3 days. No buildup, no warning. You had a headache at breakfast. You were hemorrhaging by nightfall. The disease moved without apparent logic. A veteran who had survived a decade of combat in the Caribbean could be dead of fever before a newcomer had even found lodgings. Mortality among first-year European residents during epidemic years ran close to 50%. The city only sustained its population because ships kept arriving. The moment the ships stopped, Port Royal would have emptied from disease alone. Syphilis worked more slowly, but it worked. The standard treatment was mercury, rubbed into the skin, inhaled as vapor. A cure that dismantled the body nearly as efficiently as the disease. The phrase that circulated among sailors along the harbor was blunt and accurate. A night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury. Most men who started the treatment didn't finish it. They ran out of money or patience, or they shipped out on the next available vessel and carried the disease with them to the next port. This was Port Royal's true export. Not silver, not rum. A specific, well-documented proof that a city could look like prosperity and function like a trap. June 7th, 1692. A Tuesday. The morning had been completely ordinary. Reverend Emmanuel Heath had finished his morning service at St. Paul's Church and done what any sensible man in Port Royal did with a free hour before noon. Walked to the nearest tavern. He sat down with his friend John White, president of the island's council. Two men having a drink. Nothing unusual. Heath would later describe what happened next with a precision that suggests he was still not entirely sure he had survived it. The ground moved. Not a tremor, a wave. Long, rolling oscillations passing through the stone floor beneath his feet, the way swells pass under a ship's hull. He wrote, "I saw the earth open and swallow up a multitude of people, and the sea mounting in upon us over the fortifications." What Heath was watching was liquefaction. The 65 feet of water-saturated sand beneath Port Royal, when subjected to the sustained vibration of 3 consecutive shocks, stopped behaving like solid ground and started behaving like fluid. Buildings didn't topple, they sank, straight down, vertically, with a slow and terrible deliberateness. Streets cracked open in long fissures that snapped shut again seconds later, catching whatever and whoever was standing on them. People were swallowed to the waist, to the chest, to the neck. The sand re-solidified around them. Neighbors tried to pull them free. The grip of the reset ground was stronger than any number of human hands. Dogs ate the heads that remained above the surface. That detail appears in the contemporary record without apparent horror. By 1692, Port Royal had normalized too much for horror to register cleanly. One man survived the impossible. Louis Galdi, a French Huguenot merchant, was swallowed by the earth during the second shock. Pulled down, enclosed in sand and darkness, conscious. Then the third shock came. The same force that had taken him ejected him, threw him through the reopening fissure and into the harbor. He swam. He was pulled from the water by a passing boat. He lived for another 47 years, dying in 1739 at the age of 80. His tombstone, which still stands, reads that he was swallowed up in the great earthquake and by the providence of God was by another shock thrown into the sea and miraculously saved by swimming. Then the sea arrived. The harbor receded first, drained outward, exposing the bottom. Then it returned as a wall. HMS Swan, a Royal Navy frigate moored at the dock, was lifted by the surge and deposited on top of the rooftops of buildings that were themselves already half submerged. A warship sitting on a drowned city. Within minutes, 2/3 of Port Royal's land area was gone. A pocket watch recovered from the sediment in 1959 had stopped at 11:43. The sea took Port Royal in minutes. Then it did something nobody anticipated. It preserved it. When the building sank into the anaerobic sediment on the harbor floor, sediment from which oxygen had been pressed out by the weight of water above it, the normal processes of decay slowed almost to a stop. Wood that rots in weeks in Caribbean heat survived centuries underwater. Leather held its shape. Organic material that would have turned to dust above ground remained intact beneath it. The same catastrophe that killed 2,000 people in 3 minutes, created entirely by accident. The most complete archaeological record of 17th century English colonial life anywhere on Earth. The first serious excavation began in 1981, led by archaeologist Donnie Hamilton in conjunction with the Institute of Nautical Archaeology and Texas A&M University. They worked for 9 years. What they found was not a ruin. It was an interrupted afternoon. In one building, cast iron skillets were still sitting in the hearth. The fire had been burning when the first shock hit. Charred wood was concreted to the base of the pots. Whatever was being cooked that morning was still in the process of being cooked. Nobody had touched it since 1143 on June 7th, 1692. In another area, pewter plates were found stacked exactly as they had fallen from a tilted shelf, not scattered by current, not displaced by time, but sitting in the precise configuration of objects knocked sideways in a single instant and then left completely alone. One excavated building contained, within the same 4 walls, a cobbler's workshop identified by leather scraps and shoe lasts, a butcher's operation confirmed by cut animal bones and sea turtle shells, and a tavern documented by over 60 glass liquor bottles recovered alongside tankards and keg remnants. 3 businesses, 1 address. And within the same structure, in what appeared to be a residential section, archaeologists found the remains of children, not pirates, not merchants. Children, the ones the legend has always forgotten. In 2025, UNESCO inscribed Port Royal on the World Heritage List, recognizing it as the only known submerged urban site from the modern era with structures and context this intact. The designation came 333 years after the earthquake. The objects recovered from the harbor floor, Chinese porcelain bowls that had traveled halfway around the world to sit on a Port Royal shelf, a silver spice grater, a brass pocket watch stopped at 1143, are ordinary. That is the point. Not treasure, evidence. Of a morning that didn't finish, in a city that was never quite what the legend decided it was. The people who watched from the hills didn't ask geological questions. They already had their answer. Within weeks, pulpits across Jamaica, Boston, and London were delivering the same verdict. Port Royal had been destroyed because it had earned it. Cotton Mather called it a very Sodom for wickedness, a phrase he deployed with evident satisfaction. The Jamaica Council, in the formal language of an official body, declared the earthquake an instance of God Almighty's severe judgment. Even Reverend Heath, the man who had been drinking in a tavern when the first shock hit and who survived by running toward an open fort, wrote afterward that he hoped the destruction would serve as a warning and that God would make the people of ill repute reform their lives. It went unheeded. 5 years after the earthquake, a visitor to what remained of Port Royal noted that the survivors regard nothing but money and value not how they get it. But the theological verdict had a problem. The earthquake did not distinguish between the guilty and the incidental. The sand beneath Port Royal did not know the difference between a privateer who had burned a Spanish town and a woman measuring spices in her kitchen on a Tuesday morning. The children whose bones were found under collapsed walls 3 centuries later had no part in the sins the preachers were cataloging. Providential judgment, if that is what it was, killed without any apparent interest in accuracy. The more precise reading is structural. Port Royal was destroyed by what it was built on, by the same unstable, water-saturated sand that made its deep harbor commercially unrivaled. The advantage and the vulnerability were never 2 different things. They were one thing, seen from 2 different directions. The city had a 37-year run at peak function. Its average resident didn't last much longer. Both burned at the same speed and went out the same way. And Henry Morgan, the man who had built his entire career on these streets, who had been knighted by one king and buried with full honors by another, died in 1688, 4 years before the earthquake. He was interred in Palisadoes Cemetery on the same sand strip that held Port Royal. The earthquake took the cemetery with everything else. His coffin went into the harbor. His body has never been found. The sea that he spent his life exploiting eventually took the only thing he had kept from it. That's what Port Royal is. Stripped of the legend, not a morality tale, not a pirate fantasy, not divine punishment delivered with poetic precision. A city that was always going to end this way, built by people who knew it and sailed anyway. The water gets darker from here, and we're just getting started.